His crown was built on bones. Giuliana De Luca had spent her life running from the empire her father built, but when he was assassinated, she became the last piece of a shattered kingdom. Now, the only way to survive was to marry the man her father had once called his greatest enemy. Salvatore Costa stood at the altar, dark-eyed and unreadable, waiting for her to kneel. "You don't have to love me," he murmured, brushing his fingers over her wrist. "You just have to obey." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Fallen Empire. The news arrived like a shard of ice, piercing through the carefully constructed normalcy of Giuliana De Luca's life. It wasn't a phone call, not even a discreetly worded telegram. It was a man, dressed in the somber, respectful black of a soldado delivering a message, his face etched with the grim reality of the world she had tried so desperately to escape. Her father, Don Antonio De Luca, was dead. Assassinated. The word felt foreign, brutal, a stark contrast to the sun-drenched Tuscan countryside where she had sought refuge for the past 2 decades. The villa, with its sprawling vineyards and the scent of sun-baked earth, had been her sanctuary, a place where she was simply Giuliana, the artist, not Giuliana, daughter of the infamous Don. Here, amongst the rolling hills and the gentle murmur of the Arno, she had almost managed to forget the shadows that clung to her name. Almost. She stood on the terracotta-tiled terrace, the message clutched in her hand, the paper thin and brittle, like the life she had built crumbling around her. The words were stark, economical, devoid of the flowery sentimentality her father had always despised. Don Antonio De Luca. Deceased. Return required. The soldado, whose name she hadn't bothered to ask, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes, dark and knowing, fixed on a point just beyond her shoulder. He had seen this before, the raw, disbelieving grief, the dawning realization of a life irrevocably altered. He knew what was expected of her, what the ancient, unspoken laws of their world demanded. Giuliana, however, had spent 20 years meticulously dismantling those expectations. She had traded the opulent, suffocating confines of their Roman palazzo for the freedom of anonymity. She had swapped the diamond-encrusted life of a mafia princess for the simple pleasures of creating. Her hands, once adorned with jewels, were now stained with the vibrant hues of oil paints, her canvases filled with the landscapes of her adopted home, not the grim portraits of her ancestors. "How?" she finally asked, her voice a mere whisper, carried away by the gentle breeze that rustled the leaves of the olive trees. The soldado hesitated, his gaze finally meeting hers. "A car bomb. In Palermo." It was quick. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Giuliana knew the brutal efficiency of her father's enemies. She had grown up surrounded by whispers of vendettas, of blood debts paid in full. The image slammed into her the twisted metal, the inferno, the finality. A sob escaped her, a raw, guttural sound that ripped through the tranquility of the afternoon. She hadn't loved her father, not in the traditional sense. He was a distant, formidable figure, a man who ruled his empire with an iron fist and an unwavering belief in the old ways. But he was her father, the last tangible link to a past she couldn't fully escape. She had left Rome after a particularly brutal argument, a clash of wills that had ended with her vowing never to return. She had been young then, fueled by rebellion and a desperate need to define herself outside of his shadow. He had let her go, his silence more damning than any shouted command. She had thought, perhaps foolishly, that he had understood, that he had respected her desire for a different life. Now, staring at the stark words on the paper, she realized the naivety of that belief. In their world, there was no escape. There was only loyalty, obligation, and the ever-present threat of violence. "Who?" she asked, her voice steadier now, the initial shock giving way to a cold, hard nod of fear. The soldado's silence was answer enough. The De Luca family had many enemies, their empire built on a foundation of ruthless ambition and broken alliances. But there was one name that resonated above all others, a name that had been whispered in hushed tones throughout her childhood: Costa. Salvatore Costa. Her father had always spoken of Costa with a mixture of respect and hatred, acknowledging his rival's power while simultaneously plotting his downfall. It was a complex, twisted relationship, built on a foundation of mutual animosity and begrudging admiration. The arrangements have been made, the soldado continued, his voice low, almost apologetic. Don Antonio, he anticipated this possibility. His will it stipulates he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the task before him. Juliana felt a chill crawl down her spine, a premonition of something terrible. Her father had always been meticulous, a master strategist who planned for every contingency. He had controlled every aspect of her life, even from afar. And now, even in death, his hand reached out to guide her fate. Stipulates what? She demanded, her voice sharp, tinged with a growing sense of dread. The soldado took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. He arranged a marriage. To secure the family to ensure your safety. Juliana recoiled as if struck. Marriage? To whom? The thought was absurd, repugnant. She had spent her life avoiding such a fate, fiercely guarding her independence. To whom? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper, already knowing the answer. To Don Salvatore Costa, the soldado confirmed, the words hanging heavy in the air, like a death sentence. The world around her seemed to tilt, the vibrant colors of the Tuscan landscape fading into a blur.
Salvatore Costa.
Her father's greatest enemy. The man who had likely orchestrated his death. And now, she was to be his wife. A pawn in a deadly game, a prize to be claimed. She looked at the soldado, her eyes filled with a mixture of despair and defiance. I will not, she stated, her voice trembling but firm. He simply bowed his head, a gesture of respect, but also of inevitability. You have no choice, Signorina. It is the Don's will. It is the law. He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing on the terracotta tiles, the sound a stark reminder of the world she had tried to leave behind. He paused at the edge of the terrace, his silhouette framed against the setting sun. The car is waiting. We leave at dawn. Juliana watched him go, her body numb, her mind reeling. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A beautiful sunset, a cruel mockery of the darkness that had descended upon her life. She was no longer Juliana, the artist. She was Juliana DeLuca, the reluctant heir, the pawn, the future bride of her father's killer. And she had no choice but to return to the shadows she had so desperately tried to escape. The scent of the approaching rain carried a different kind of chill, one that settled deep in her bones. Chapter 2. Whispers of a Dark Legacy. The journey back to Rome was a blur of muted grays and oppressive silence. Juliana sat in the back of the black sedan, the soldado, whose name she now knew was Marco, driving with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to navigating the treacherous currents of their world. The Tuscan countryside, with its rolling hills and sun-drenched vineyards, faded into the distance, replaced by the increasingly urban landscape of the approaching city. Each mile felt like a step further into a past she had tried to bury, a world of whispered secrets and veiled threats. She hadn't spoken to Marco since leaving the villa, the weight of her impending fate a suffocating presence in the confined space. The silence, however, was not empty. It was filled with the ghosts of her childhood, the echoes of her father's booming voice, the hushed conversations of men in dark suits, the constant, underlying tension that had permeated every aspect of her upbringing. She remembered the palazzo, their ancestral home, a sprawling, opulent structure that felt more like a fortress than a home. Its high walls and heavy gates had offered a semblance of security, but they had also served to imprison her, to isolate her from the world outside. She had spent countless hours wandering its vast, echoing halls, surrounded by portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. Her mother, a beautiful, fragile woman, had died when Juliana was young, a victim of a lingering illness, the details of which had always been shrouded in secrecy. Juliana had only fragmented memories of her a gentle touch, a soft voice singing lullabies, the lingering scent of jasmine perfume. Her absence had left a void in Juliana's life, a void that her father, with his cold, distant demeanor, had never been able to fill. She had found solace in art, escaping into the world of colors and textures, creating her own realities on canvas. It was a passion that her father had tolerated, but never truly understood. He had wanted her to be a lady, a proper mafia princess, prepared to marry well and secure the family's future. She had rebelled, fiercely clinging to her independence, determined to forge her own path. Now, that path had led her back to the very place she had sworn to leave behind, back to the suffocating embrace of her family's legacy. And it had led her to Salvatore Costa. The name itself conjured images of darkness and danger. She had never met him, but she had heard the whispers, the stories of his ruthlessness, his ambition, his unwavering loyalty to his own family. He was a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure, a man who had risen through the ranks of the underworld to become one of the most powerful figures in Italy. She tried to imagine him, to conjure a face to match the reputation. She pictured a man with cold, calculating eyes, a cruel smile, a presence that radiated power and menace. The image sent a shiver of fear down her spine. As they approached the city, the sky grew darker, heavy with the promise of a storm. The first drops of rain began to fall, streaking the windows of the car, blurring the lights of the city. The atmosphere mirrored her own inner turmoil, the growing sense of dread and uncertainty. She glanced at Marco, his profile etched against the flickering lights of the dashboard. He was a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, but his eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much. He was loyal to her father, to the family, to the code. She wondered if he pitied her, if he understood the weight of the burden she was carrying. "He's waiting for you," Marco said, his voice low, breaking the silence for the first time in hours. Juliana didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. She knew who he was.
Salvatore Costa.
The man who held her fate in his hands. The car turned onto a long, winding driveway, lined with ancient cypress trees, their branches swaying in the wind like mournful sentinels. The palazzo loomed ahead, its imposing facade illuminated by strategically placed spotlights, casting long, eerie shadows. It was even more intimidating than she remembered, a symbol of power and wealth, but also of darkness and secrets. As they pulled up to the main entrance, a phalanx of men in dark suits emerged, their faces grim, their eyes watchful. They were Costa's men, she realized, the guardians of her new prison. Marco opened the car door for her, his hand hovering protectively near her arm. She stepped out, the cold, damp air hitting her face like a slap. The rain was falling harder now, a steady downpour that soaked her clothes and plastered her hair to her forehead. She looked up at the palazzo, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back. She was home, but it was a home she no longer recognized, a home that felt more like a tomb. A figure emerged from the shadows of the entrance, tall and imposing, his silhouette framed against the warm, inviting light spilling from within. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator approaching his prey. As he drew closer, she could make out his features: a strong jaw, a sharp nose, dark, intense eyes that seemed to pierce through her. It was Salvatore Costa. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, judging. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his late 30s, but his presence was undeniably powerful, commanding. He exuded an aura of confidence and control, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Juliana De Luca," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, a claiming of possession. "Welcome home." The words were polite, almost courteous, but there was an underlying steeliness to his tone, a hint of the power he wielded. He offered her his arm, a gesture that was both an invitation and a command. She hesitated for a moment, her instinct screaming at her to run, to escape. But she knew there was no escape. She was trapped, bound by her father's will, by the ancient laws of their world. With a deep breath, she placed her hand on his arm, the touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. His skin was warm, surprisingly soft, beneath the fabric of his expensive suit. It was a small detail, but it was unexpected, unsettling. He led her inside, the heavy oak doors closing behind them with a resounding thud, sealing her fate. The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest within her heart. As he guided her through the opulently decorated entrance hall, the portraits on the walls seemed to whisper accusations and warnings. She could hear the faint echo of her father's voice, a final, chilling decree. Chapter 3. The Enemy's Proposal. The grand hall of the Costa Palazzo was a study in opulent intimidation. Marble floors, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the light of massive crystal chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceiling. Frescoes depicting scenes of Roman gods and goddesses adorned the walls, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the somber mood that permeated the air. It was a space designed to impress, to overwhelm, to remind visitors of the power and wealth of the Costa family. Juliana felt dwarfed by the sheer scale of it all, a small, insignificant figure in a vast, unfamiliar landscape. Salvatore led her through the hall, his hand still resting lightly on her arm, a constant, subtle reminder of his control. She could feel the eyes of his men upon her, watchful, assessing, their presence a silent, ever-present threat. They passed through several antechambers, each more lavishly decorated than the last, filled with antique furniture, priceless artwork, and the subtle scent of old money and power. The silence between them was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of their shared history, their conflicting destinies, hanging heavy in the air. Finally, they reached a smaller, more intimate room, a study, perhaps, or a private library. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, their gold-leaf titles gleaming in the soft light. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, providing a semblance of warmth in the otherwise cold, formal atmosphere. Salvatore released her arm, gesturing towards a pair of plush armchairs positioned in front of the fireplace. "Please sit," he said, his voice still low and resonant, but with a hint of something else, a subtle inflection that she couldn't quite decipher. She hesitated for a moment, then did as he instructed, sinking into the soft cushions of the armchair. He remained standing, his back to the fire, his silhouette outlined against the flames. He was a striking figure, even more so in this setting. He wore a dark suit that fit him perfectly, accentuating his broad shoulders and lean physique. His dark hair was neatly styled, his features sharp and defined, his eyes, dark and intense, fixed on her with an unwavering gaze. "I imagine you have many questions," he said, breaking the silence. Juliana nodded, her throat dry.
Why?
She asked, the word barely a whisper. "Why would you agree to this arrangement?" He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your father was a pragmatic man. He understood the realities of our world. He knew that alliances are forged through blood, through marriage. And you see me as an alliance?" she asked, her voice laced with bitterness. He shrugged, a subtle movement of his shoulders. "You are the key to uniting our families, to ending the feud that has consumed us for generations." Your father understood that. He saw it as a necessary sacrifice. "And what do you see it as?" she challenged, her gaze meeting his unflinchingly. He paused for a moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher her thoughts, her emotions. "I see it as an opportunity," he finally said. "An opportunity to build something new, something stronger. An opportunity to end the bloodshed." "And what if I refuse?" she asked, knowing the answer, but needing to hear it from him. His smile faded, his expression hardening. "You have no choice, Juliana. Your father's will is binding. The code demands it. And frankly," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I will not allow you to refuse." The threat was clear, unmistakable. She was his, a prize to be claimed, a pawn in his game. "You killed my father," she said, the accusation hanging heavy in the air.
He didn't deny it.
He didn't even flinch. Your father and I were enemies. We both knew the risks. It was inevitable. And you expect me to marry my father's killer? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief and anger. I expect you to honor your father's wishes, he corrected, his voice firm. I expect you to be a dutiful wife. I expect you to obey. The word obey hung in the air, a stark reminder of her powerlessness. She was trapped, bound by duty, by tradition, by the will of a dead man. And what do I get in return? She asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. He moved closer, his presence filling the space between them, his scent a subtle blend of expensive cologne and something darker, more primal enveloping her. You get protection, he said, his voice low and seductive. You get security. You get a life of luxury and privilege.
You get me.
He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a shiver of unexpected sensation through her. It was a gesture of intimacy, of possession, that both terrified and intrigued her. I do not offer you love, Juliana, he said, his eyes searching hers. But I offer you respect. I offer you loyalty. And I offer you a place at my side. You will be the queen of my empire. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. You don't have to love me, he murmured, his voice a husky whisper. You just have to obey. The words echoed the sentiment from the telegram, bringing the situation full circle. His gaze was intense, unwavering, demanding her submission. She was caught in a web of power and obligation, with no escape in sight. The fire crackled behind him, casting his face in a flickering, almost demonic light. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that her life had irrevocably changed. The question wasn't whether she would marry him, but how she would survive this gilded cage, this forced union with her father's enemy. And, buried beneath the fear, a spark of defiance began to flicker. Chapter 4. A Vow of Shadows and Secrets. The wedding was a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated display of power and wealth designed to solidify the alliance between the De Luca and Costa families. It was held in the Grand Cathedral of San Giovanni in Laterano, its soaring arches and intricate mosaics providing a breathtaking backdrop for the somber ceremony. The church was filled with hundreds of guests, a mix of family, friends, and business associates, their faces a mixture of curiosity, respect, and veiled apprehension. Juliana stood at the altar, a vision in a custom-made ivory gown, its intricate lace and delicate beading a testament to the artistry of Roman couture. The dress was beautiful, exquisite, but it felt like a costume, a symbol of the role she was being forced to play. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo, adorned with a diamond tiara that had belonged to Salvatore's mother. The weight of the jewels felt heavy on her head, a constant reminder of the legacy she was marrying into. She had barely spoken to Salvatore since their encounter in his study. The days leading up to the wedding had been a whirlwind of activity, filled with dress fittings, meetings with lawyers, and endless preparations. She had moved into the Costa Palazzo, her belongings from the Tuscan villa carefully unpacked and arranged in a lavish suite of rooms that felt more like a gilded cage than a home. She had been given a staff of servants, all of whom treated her with a deference that bordered on fear. She was surrounded by luxury, by opulence, but she felt utterly alone, isolated in a world of strangers. As she waited for the ceremony to begin, she glanced around the cathedral, her eyes searching for a friendly face, a sign of support. But there was none. Her few friends from her life in Tuscany had not been invited, deemed unsuitable for such a high-profile event. She was surrounded by the faces of her father's former associates, men who had once looked at her with a mixture of respect and disdain, now viewing her as a prize, a trophy, a symbol of the Costa family's victory. The organ music swelled, signaling the start of the ceremony. The massive doors of the cathedral swung open, and Salvatore appeared, walking down the aisle with his mother, a formidable woman with steely gray eyes and a regal bearing. He looked even more imposing in his tailored tuxedo, his dark hair slicked back, his features set in an expression of stoic determination. He reached the altar, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. There was no warmth in his gaze, no hint of affection. It was a look of possession, of ownership, that sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. The ceremony proceeded with a solemn formality, the ancient Latin words echoing through the vast space. Juliana felt detached, numb, as if she were watching the events unfold from a distance. She repeated the vows mechanically, her voice barely a whisper, the words feeling hollow and meaningless. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Salvatore turned to her, his eyes dark and unreadable. He lifted her veil, his fingers brushing against her cheek, sending a jolt of unexpected sensation through her. He leaned in, his lips pressing against hers in a brief, formal kiss. It was a chaste kiss, devoid of passion, but it was a seal, a binding of their lives together. The guests erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the cathedral. Juliana felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She was now Signora Costa, the wife of her father's enemy, the queen of his empire. The reception was held in the sprawling gardens of the Costa Palazzo, a lavish affair with hundreds of guests, overflowing with food, wine, and music. Juliana moved through the crowd like a ghost, smiling politely, exchanging pleasantries, but feeling utterly disconnected from the revelry. Salvatore remained by her side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, a constant reminder of his control. He introduced her to a seemingly endless stream of people, their names and faces blurring together in a dizzying whirl. She noticed the whispers, the curious glances, the veiled assessments. She was an outsider, a De Luca, marrying into the Costa family. She could sense the underlying tension, the unspoken rivalries, the shifting alliances. It was a dangerous game, and she was a pawn caught in the middle. As the evening wore on, the sky darkened, and the first stars began to appear. The gardens were illuminated by thousands of twinkling lights, creating a magical, almost surreal atmosphere. But the beauty of the setting did little to ease the turmoil in Juliana's heart. She found herself standing alone on a secluded terrace, overlooking the city. The lights of Rome twinkled below, a vast, sprawling panorama of life and activity. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, of isolation. "It's a beautiful view," a voice said from behind her. She turned to see Salvatore approaching, his expression softened by the dim light. He held 2 glasses of champagne in his hand, offering one to her. She took the glass, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. They stood in silence for a moment, sipping their champagne, the only sound the distant hum of the city and the faint strains of music from the reception. "You seem distant," Salvatore said, his eyes searching hers. She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "It's been a long day," she said, a non-committal answer. He nodded, understanding more than she had revealed.
"It's a lot to take in," he said.
A new life, a new family, a new husband. She finally met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and defiance. "I didn't choose this life," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "No," he agreed, his expression softening further. "But it is yours now, and we must make the best of it." "And how do we do that?" she asked, a hint of bitterness in her tone. He stepped closer, his presence filling her senses. "By understanding each other," he said, his voice low and intimate. "By building trust. By accepting our fate." He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her skin. The touch was unexpected, sending a shiver of awareness through her. "I know this is not what you wanted, Juliana," he said, his voice sincere. "But I will do everything in my power to make you content. I will protect you. I will provide for you. I will respect you." His words were a promise, a vow, but they were also a challenge. He was offering her a semblance of peace, of security, but at a price. The price of her freedom, of her independence. As the fireworks began, exploding in a dazzling display of color and light above the city, Juliana wondered if she could ever truly accept this fate, This life with a man she was supposed to hate. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, illuminated by the fleeting brilliance of the exploding shells. The future was uncertain, a dark and treacherous path, but she knew one thing: she would not surrender without a fight. Chapter 5. Beneath the Gilded Cage. The first few weeks of her marriage were a surreal blend of opulent luxury and stifling confinement. Juliana found herself adrift in a world of unspoken rules and expectations, navigating the complex dynamics of the Costa household with a mixture of trepidation and quiet defiance. The palazzo, while undeniably beautiful, felt like a gilded cage. Every room was meticulously decorated, filled with priceless antiques and artwork, but it lacked warmth, personality, the sense of a lived-in home. She had a staff of servants at her beck and call, catering to her every need, but their constant presence felt intrusive, suffocating. She spent her days exploring the vast palazzo, wandering through its echoing halls and hidden courtyards, trying to find a space, a corner, where she could feel a sense of belonging. She discovered a small, neglected library tucked away on the third floor, its shelves filled with dusty, forgotten volumes. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the watchful eyes of the household and lose herself in the pages of a book. Her relationship with Salvatore remained formal, distant. He was a busy man, consumed by the demands of his empire, often disappearing for hours, even days, on business. He treated her with a polite courtesy, a respectful distance that both frustrated and relieved her. He was attentive, ensuring she had everything she needed, every comfort, but there was no intimacy, no genuine connection between them. She often found herself observing him, studying him, trying to decipher the man behind the mask of power and control. She saw glimpses of something else, a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of loneliness that intrigued her. He was a complex, enigmatic figure, a man shrouded in secrets and contradictions. She learned more about him from his staff, from the hushed conversations she overheard, the veiled references to his past. She learned that he had inherited the leadership of the Costa family at a young age, after his father had been killed in a similar manner to hers, another victim of the endless cycle of violence and revenge. She learned that he was a ruthless businessman, a formidable leader, but also a man of his word, a man who valued loyalty above all else. She began to understand the weight of the responsibility he carried, the pressure he was under to maintain his family's power and protect their interests. She saw the toll it took on him, the weariness in his eyes, the lines of stress etched on his face. One evening, she found him in his study, poring over documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening slightly. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Just business," he said, a non-committal answer. She noticed a weariness in his eyes, a vulnerability that he usually kept hidden. She felt a flicker of empathy, a surprising urge to comfort him. "It must be difficult," she said, choosing her words carefully. He looked at her, surprised by her observation. "It is," he admitted, his voice low. "A constant battle, a constant threat." She moved closer, drawn to him by an inexplicable force. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This life?" He paused for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "Regret is a luxury I cannot afford," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "It is my duty, my obligation." She understood. She felt the same weight of obligation, the same sense of being trapped by her family's legacy. "But it doesn't have to be lonely," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was unexpected, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "Perhaps not," he said, his voice a husky whisper. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. She found herself drawn to him, captivated by his intensity, by the vulnerability she glimpsed beneath his carefully constructed facade. For a moment, the world outside faded away, and there was only the two of them, suspended in a space of unspoken longing. He kissed her, a tentative, questioning touch of his lips to hers. It was different from their wedding kiss, softer, more intimate. It was a spark, a flicker of something that could be more. The kiss deepened. It wasn't aggressive, but exploratory. He was searching, and so was she. But then, a sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. Salvatore pulled away, his expression hardening, the mask of control slipping back into place. "Enter," he commanded, his voice regaining its usual authority. One of his men entered, his face grim. "Don Salvatore," he said, his voice urgent. "There's been a development." Salvatore's attention shifted immediately, his focus returning to the business at hand. He dismissed Juliana with a curt nod, his eyes already focused on the man before him. Juliana left the study, her heart pounding, her senses reeling. The brief moment of intimacy, of connection, had been shattered, leaving her feeling confused, vulnerable, and strangely disappointed. The interruption served as a stark reminder of the world they inhabited, a world where personal desires were always secondary to the demands of the family, to the code. And yet, a seed had been planted, a hint of possibility. The gilded cage might still be a prison, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a glimmer of hope for something more. The air felt thick with unspoken words, a promise and a warning intertwined. Chapter 6. Echoes of Betrayal. The development, as Salvatore's man had so discreetly put it, turned out to be a direct challenge to the newly formed alliance between the Costa and De Luca families. A shipment of goods, crucial to a lucrative deal Salvatore had been working on for months, had been intercepted and destroyed. It was a clear act of aggression, a message sent by a rival family, the Marchettis, who had long been vying for control of the same territory. The news sent a ripple of tension through the palazzo. The atmosphere became even more guarded, the security tighter, the whispers more hushed. Juliana found herself increasingly isolated, confined to her rooms, her movements restricted. Salvatore was consumed by the crisis, his time and attention completely absorbed by the need to retaliate, to reassert his dominance. She saw him only in passing, his face grim, his eyes shadowed with worry and anger. He was a different man from the one who had kissed her in his study, the vulnerability she had glimpsed replaced by a cold, ruthless determination. She tried to occupy herself, to distract herself from the growing sense of unease. She spent hours in the library, losing herself in books, trying to escape the reality of her situation. But even there, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of being a prisoner in her own home. One afternoon, while browsing the shelves, she stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind a row of ancient legal tomes. Curiosity piqued. She carefully opened it, revealing a small, locked wooden box. It was old, intricately carved, with a tarnished brass lock. She knew she shouldn't, that it was a violation of privacy, but she couldn't resist the urge to open it. She found a small, antique key hidden amongst the books, its intricate design matching the lock on the box. With trembling hands, she inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open, revealing the contents of the box. Inside, she found a collection of old letters tied together with a faded ribbon and a small, black and white photograph. The letters were written in Italian, in a delicate, feminine hand. She recognized the handwriting from a signature she had seen on some family documents that she was given to sign. With a jolt, she realized they were written by Salvatore's mother, Isabella Costa. Intrigued, she began to read. The letters were addressed to a man named Alessandro, and they were filled with passionate declarations of love, with expressions of longing and desire. They spoke of secret meetings, of stolen moments, of a forbidden romance. As she read further, a chilling realization dawned upon her. The letters were dated years before Isabella's marriage to Salvatore's father, Don Lorenzo Costa. And the man she was writing to, Alessandro, was not Lorenzo. He was, according to the letters, a member of a rival family, the De Lucas. Juliana's family. Her breath caught in her throat. This was a secret, a hidden betrayal that had been buried for decades. Isabella Costa, the formidable matriarch, had had a secret lover, a man from the enemy camp. She carefully examined the photograph. It showed a young woman, strikingly beautiful, with dark hair and intense eyes. Isabella Costa. She was standing next to a tall, handsome man, his arm around her waist, a look of adoration in his eyes. Juliana felt a jolt of recognition. The man resembled her father, Antonio. But it couldn't be, this picture looked too old. Then she remembered something her nana had mentioned once. Her father had an older brother, who died young.
Alessandro.
The implications of this discovery were staggering. Salvatore's mother had had an affair with a De Luca, possibly Juliana's uncle. It was a betrayal of epic proportions, a secret that could shatter the fragile peace between the two families. She carefully replaced the letters and the photograph in the box, locking it and returning it to its hiding place. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding. She had stumbled upon a dangerous secret, a truth that could have devastating consequences. She knew she should tell Salvatore, that he had a right to know. But she hesitated. The timing was wrong. He was already consumed by the conflict with the Marchettis, his position precarious. Revealing this secret now could destabilize everything, could spark a new wave of violence and bloodshed. But keeping the secret felt equally dangerous. It was a burden, a weight on her conscience. She was caught in a web of lies and deceit, surrounded by enemies and uncertain of whom to trust. As she sat there, alone in the library, the shadows lengthening around her, she realized that she was no longer just a pawn in this game. She was a player, whether she wanted to be or not. She had knowledge, a secret that gave her power, but also made her a target. She heard the sound of footsteps approaching, the heavy tread of Salvatore's boots on the marble floor. She quickly closed the book she was pretending to read, her heart pounding in her chest. He entered the library, his expression grim, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Juliana," he said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." She looked at him, her mind racing. Had he discovered her secret? Did he know about the letters? Or was this about something else entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at her, a cold knot of fear in her stomach. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, a silent battle of wills brewing beneath the surface. Chapter 7. The Unseen Scars. Salvatore's "we need to talk" was not, as Juliana had feared, about the hidden letters. It was about the escalating conflict with the Marchettis. He had received information, he explained, that the Marchettis were planning a more direct attack, a move that could potentially destabilize his entire operation. He paced the library, his agitation evident in every movement, his voice tight with controlled anger. He spoke of strategies, of retaliations, of the need to maintain his position of power. He spoke of loyalty, of betrayal, of the constant threat that hung over their lives. Juliana listened, her mind still reeling from her discovery in the library, but she forced herself to focus on his words, to understand the gravity of the situation. She realized that he was not just talking to her, he was confiding in her, seeking her understanding, perhaps even her support. "It's a dangerous game, Juliana," he said, stopping in front of her, his eyes searching hers. "A game with no rules, no mercy." "I know," she said, her voice soft. She understood more than he realized. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I sometimes wonder if it's worth it," he admitted, his voice tinged with weariness. "All this violence, all this bloodshed." It was a glimpse of vulnerability, a crack in his carefully constructed facade, that surprised her. She saw, for the first time, the toll this life had taken on him, the burden he carried. "What else would you do?" she asked, her voice gentle. He shrugged, a helpless gesture.
"I don't know," he said.
"It's all I've ever known. It's in my blood. It's my destiny." She saw the sadness in his eyes, the loneliness that mirrored her own. She felt a surge of empathy for him, a connection that transcended their forced marriage, their conflicting families. She reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. "It doesn't have to be," she said, her voice firm. "There could be another way." He looked at her, surprised by her words, by her touch. What other way? He asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. I don't know, she admitted. But there has to be a way to break the cycle. To find peace. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be considering her words, weighing them against the reality of his world. You're a dreamer, Juliana, he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Like your father used to say, too soft for this world. Perhaps, she said, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. But perhaps that's what this world needs. A little softness. A little hope. He didn't respond, but he didn't dismiss her words either. He continued to look at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher her, to understand her. The moment was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of raised voices, of running feet. Salvatore's expression hardened, the mask of control slipping back into place. Stay here, he commanded, his voice sharp. He left the library, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Juliana remained where she was, her heart pounding in her chest. The fragile peace, the tentative connection they had shared, had been shattered once again by the realities of their world. She waited, anxiously listening to the sounds of the unfolding events. She heard shouts, commands, the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Then silence. After what felt like an eternity, Salvatore returned, his face grim, his clothes slightly disheveled. He had a cut on his cheek, a thin line of blood trickling down his skin. What happened? She asked, her voice filled with concern. An attempted attack, he said, his voice tight. One of Marchetti's men. He got inside the palazzo. Are you all right? She asked, reaching out to touch his cheek. He flinched slightly at her touch, but he didn't pull away. I'm fine, he said, his voice gruff. It's nothing. But she saw the pain in his eyes, the vulnerability he tried to hide. She saw the scars, not just the physical ones, but the deeper, unseen scars of a life lived in constant danger, in constant fear. She gently wiped the blood from his cheek with her handkerchief, her touch lingering on his skin. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper, something that she couldn't quite decipher. Thank you, he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. In that moment, standing there in the dimly lit library, surrounded by the echoes of violence and betrayal, she saw him, not as Don Salvatore Costa, the ruthless leader, but as a man, a human being, wounded and vulnerable. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she was falling in love with him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, a terrifying and exhilarating truth. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, a turning point hanging precariously between them. Chapter 8. A glimmer of defiance. The attack, though thwarted, left a palpable tension in the air. Security was tightened even further, and Salvatore became even more withdrawn, his focus entirely consumed by the escalating conflict with the Marchettis. Juliana found herself increasingly isolated, her movements restricted, her interactions with Salvatore limited to brief, formal exchanges. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, a spark of defiance had been ignited within her. The near attack and Salvatore's subsequent vulnerability had solidified her resolve to find a way out of the cycle of violence, to forge a different path, not just for herself, but for him as well. She began to subtly rebel against the constraints of her role as the Don's wife. She started small, defying the unspoken rules that governed her life. She ventured beyond the confines of her assigned rooms, exploring the palazzo, engaging in conversations with the staff, learning more about the inner workings of the Costa Empire. She discovered that many of the servants, despite their outward deference, were weary of the constant violence, the endless feuds. They longed for peace, for stability, for a life free from fear. She found allies in unexpected places, people who shared her desire for a different future. She also began to use her artistic skills, once a source of personal escape, as a tool for connection and communication. She started sketching portraits of the staff, capturing their personalities, their hidden emotions on paper. It was a small act of rebellion, a way of asserting her individuality, of reclaiming her identity. One afternoon, she was sketching in the garden, capturing the vibrant colors of the blooming flowers, when Salvatore found her. He stood watching her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You haven't lost your touch," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. She looked up, surprised by his presence, by his words. "I try not to," she said, a hint of defiance in her tone. He moved closer, his gaze fixed on her sketch. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice sincere. She shrugged, uncomfortable with his praise. "It's just a distraction," she said. "Perhaps," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But it's also a reminder of the beauty that still exists in this world, of the hope." He remembered their conversation in the library, her words about finding another way, about breaking the cycle of violence. She saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a hint of shared longing. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice hesitant, "about what you said, about your destiny." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued.
"And?" he asked.
"And I don't believe it," she said, her voice firm. "I don't believe we are bound by our past, by our family's legacies. I believe we can choose a different path." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "It's not that simple, Juliana," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "There are obligations, responsibilities, expectations. But there is also choice," she insisted. "We can choose to break free, to forge our own destiny." He didn't respond, but he didn't dismiss her words either. He continued to look at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find an answer, a solution in her gaze. "I know it's dangerous," she said, her voice softer now. "I know it's risky. But isn't it worth fighting for? For a life of peace? For a future without fear?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Juliana," he said, his voice weary. "I just don't know." But she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a hint of uncertainty that gave her hope. She had planted a seed of defiance, of possibility. She continued to press him, subtly, gently, challenging his assumptions, questioning his beliefs. She used every opportunity to remind him of the beauty, the goodness that still existed in the world, of the possibility of a different life. She knew it was a long shot, a dangerous gamble. She was walking a tightrope, balancing between her desire for change and the need to protect herself, to survive. But she was determined to try, to fight for a future that was not defined by violence and bloodshed. As the days turned into weeks, she saw small changes in Salvatore, subtle shifts in his demeanor. He became less guarded, more open, more willing to listen to her, to consider her perspective. He started spending more time with her, engaging in conversations that went beyond the usual formalities. He even started to join her in the garden, watching her sketch, sharing his thoughts and feelings, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the mask of the dawn. It was a slow, gradual process, a dance of defiance and desire, of hope and fear. But it was a start, a glimmer of light in the darkness. The scent of the flowers seemed to carry a new fragrance, one of possibility and change, a fragile promise blooming in the heart of their dangerous world. Chapter 9. The Weight of Unspoken Truths. The fragile peace that Juliana had begun to cultivate within the walls of the Costa Palazzo was shattered by a sudden, unexpected revelation. A late-night meeting, convened by Salvatore, brought together the key members of the Costa family, his advisors, his lieutenants, the men who controlled the various aspects of his empire. Juliana was not invited to the meeting, but she could sense the tension in the air, the hushed whispers, the grim faces. She knew something was wrong, something significant. She waited anxiously in her rooms, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She tried to distract herself, to focus on her sketching, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease, of impending doom. After what felt like an eternity, Salvatore finally came to her, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with a mixture of anger and despair. He closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate, controlled. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What's happened?" He hesitated for a moment, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond her shoulder. "They've found him," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Found who?" she asked, her confusion growing. "Alessandro," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "The man who betrayed my father. The man who killed him." Juliana's breath caught in her throat.
Alessandro.
The name echoed in her mind, bringing back the images of the hidden letters, the secret photograph, the forbidden love. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had kept the secret for too long, and now it was coming back to haunt her.
"How?"
she asked, her voice barely audible. "An informant," he said, his voice bitter. "Someone within Marchetti's ranks. They've been holding him captive, torturing him for information."
"And?"
she prompted, her heart pounding in her chest. "And he confessed," Salvatore said, his voice filled with pain. "He confessed to everything. To the affair with my mother.
"To the plot to kill my father."
Juliana felt a cold dread creep through her veins. The truth was out, the secret revealed. But it was a twisted, distorted truth, a truth that had been manipulated, used as a weapon. "Salvatore," she began, her voice urgent. "There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you sooner." He looked at her, his eyes filled with suspicion, with pain. "What?" he asked, his voice sharp. She hesitated, struggling to find the words. How could she explain the complexities of the situation, the nuances of the past, the hidden truths that she had uncovered? "The letters," she said, her voice trembling. "Your mother's letters. I found them, hidden in the library." His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "What letters?" he demanded. She explained, haltingly, about the hidden compartment, the locked box, the passionate correspondence between Isabella Costa and Alessandro De Luca. She told him about the photograph, about the evidence of a forbidden love, a secret affair that had predated his father's death. He listened in silence, his face growing paler with each word. He didn't interrupt, he didn't question, he just stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. When she had finished, he stood there for a moment, his body rigid, his hands clenched into fists. Then he turned away, his back to her, his shoulders shaking slightly.
"You knew?"
he asked, his voice low, choked with emotion. "You knew all this time and you didn't tell me?" I was afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to hurt you." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing pain. "Hurt me?" he repeated, his voice laced with bitterness. "You think keeping this from me would protect me? You think shielding me from the truth would somehow make it less real?" She couldn't answer. She had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. She had let her fear, her uncertainty, cloud her judgment. She had betrayed his trust, and now she was paying the price. I thought I could find a way," she stammered, her voice breaking. "A way to fix things. To prevent more bloodshed." "There is no fixing this, Juliana," he said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. "There is only the truth. And the truth is my mother was a whore. And your family is responsible for my father's death." The words hit her like a physical blow. She recoiled, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She had tried to protect him, to shield him from the pain, but she had only made things worse. He turned and walked towards the door, his movements stiff, controlled. He paused at the threshold, his back still to her. "I need some time," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "To process this. To decide what to do." He left the room, closing the door behind him with a resounding thud. Juliana stood there alone, her body numb, her mind reeling. The weight of unspoken truths, of hidden betrayals, had finally come crashing down, crushing her, leaving her shattered and alone. The silence in the room was deafening, a stark contrast to the storm raging within her. Chapter 10. Masks and Mirrors. The days following Salvatore's revelation were a blur of strained silence and unspoken accusations. He retreated into himself, becoming even more distant and unapproachable. He avoided Juliana, their interactions limited to brief, formal exchanges, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. Juliana felt utterly alone, isolated in the vast palazzo, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the weight of her own mistakes. She had betrayed his trust, and she didn't know how to repair the damage. She tried to reach out to him, to apologize, to explain, but he rebuffed her efforts, his heart seemingly closed off to her. She understood his pain, his anger, his sense of betrayal, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. She spent her days wandering the palazzo, lost in her thoughts, replaying the events of the past few weeks, searching for a way to make amends, to find a path back to him. She found herself drawn to the library, to the hidden compartment where she had discovered the letters. She took out the box, her hands trembling, and reread the passionate correspondence between Isabella Costa and Alessandro De Luca. She studied the photograph, examining the faces of the two lovers, searching for clues, for answers. She saw the love in their eyes, the passion, the longing, but she also saw the sadness, the desperation, the knowledge that their love was forbidden, doomed. She began to understand the complexities of the situation, the nuances of the past, the hidden truths that had shaped their lives. She realized that it wasn't a simple story of good versus evil, of victim and perpetrator. It was a story of love and betrayal, of loyalty and sacrifice, of choices made in the face of impossible circumstances. She also realized that Salvatore was not just angry with her, he was angry with his mother, with his father, with the entire legacy of violence and deceit that had defined his family for generations. He was trapped in a web of lies and secrets, and he didn't know how to break free. She decided to try a different approach. She would not apologize again. She would not beg for forgiveness. She would show him, through her actions, that she understood, that she cared, that she was willing to fight for him, for their future. She started by researching the history of the Costa and De Luca families, delving into the archives, seeking to understand the origins of the feud, the roots of the conflict. She discovered a long and complicated history of betrayal and revenge, of broken alliances and shifting loyalties. She also discovered that there had been moments of peace, of cooperation, of attempts to bridge the divide. There had been individuals on both sides who had sought to end the bloodshed, to find a way to coexist. She began to see a pattern, a cycle of violence that had been perpetuated for generations. And she realized that she and Salvatore were caught in that cycle, trapped by the mistakes of the past. She decided to use her art, her passion for creating, as a tool for healing, for communication. She started working on a new series of paintings, inspired by the history of the two families, by the letters, by the photograph. She painted scenes of love and loss, of betrayal and forgiveness, of hope and despair. She painted the faces of Isabella and Alessandro, of Lorenzo and Antonio, of Salvatore and herself. She painted the masks they wore, the facades they presented to the world, and the hidden truths that lay beneath. She painted the mirrors that reflected their shared pain, their shared longing, their shared humanity. She worked tirelessly, pouring her heart and soul into her art, hoping that it would speak to Salvatore, that it would reach him in a way that words could not. She worked in secret, hidden away in a small, unused studio she had discovered in the palazzo, transforming it into her sanctuary, her refuge. As she painted, she began to see a glimmer of hope, a path forward. She realized that the only way to break the cycle of violence was to confront the past, to acknowledge the truth, to forgive, and to choose a different future. The silence in the studio was punctuated only by the soft strokes of her brush, a silent prayer for redemption and a new beginning. The colors on the canvas seemed to mirror the turbulent emotions swirling within her, a visual representation of the storm she hoped to weather. Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty. Juliana's artistic endeavors did not go unnoticed. Word of her secret project reached Salvatore, whispered by the servants, carried on the wind. He was intrigued, curious, despite his attempts to remain distant, to maintain his emotional walls. He found her one evening in the hidden studio, surrounded by her paintings, her hands and clothes stained with paint, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. He stood at the doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable. She didn't notice him at first, lost in her work, her brushstrokes flowing with a passionate intensity. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the gentle curve of her lips as she focused, the way the light caught the strands of her hair. He saw the raw emotion she poured into her work, the vulnerability she exposed on the canvas. Finally, she sensed his presence, turning to face him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Salvatore," she said, her voice hesitant. I didn't hear you come in." He stepped into the studio, his gaze sweeping over the paintings, his eyes lingering on the portraits of his mother and Alessandro, of his father and Antonio, of himself and Juliana. He saw the love, the loss, the betrayal, the forgiveness, all captured in vibrant colors and bold strokes. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low, his tone difficult to decipher. "It's an exploration," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Of our families, of our history, of us." He moved closer, examining the paintings more closely, his eyes searching for meaning, for understanding. He saw the masks, the mirrors, the hidden truths that she had revealed. "You're trying to understand," he said, his voice a statement, not a question. "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm trying to understand. To find a way forward. For both of us." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and confusion. "I don't know if there is a way forward, Juliana," he said, his voice weary. "Not after everything." "There has to be," she insisted, her voice firm. "We can't let the past define us. We can't let the cycle of violence continue." He looked at her, his expression softening slightly. He saw the determination in her eyes, the passion, the unwavering belief in the possibility of change. "You're a remarkable woman, Juliana," he said, his voice sincere. "You see the world differently. You see me differently." She reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of comfort, of connection. "I see the man you are," she said, her voice soft. "The man beneath the mask. The man who deserves to be happy." He covered her hand with his fingers interlacing with hers. He felt the warmth of her touch, the strength of her spirit. He felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility, stirring within him. I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm lost, Juliana."
I'm afraid.
"We'll find our way together," she said, her voice firm. "We'll face it together." He leaned in and kissed her, a tentative, questioning touch of his lips to hers. It was different from their previous kisses, softer, more intimate, filled with a vulnerability that he had never shown her before. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. It was a release of pent-up emotions, of unspoken desires, of shared pain and longing. It was a connection, a bond, forged in the crucible of their shared suffering. But then, a sudden, sharp sound shattered the moment. A gunshot, followed by shouts, by the sounds of running feet. Salvatore pulled away, his expression hardening, the mask of control slipping back into place. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice sharp. He left the studio, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he always carried beneath his jacket. Juliana remained where she was, her heart pounding in her chest. The fragile peace, the tentative connection they had shared, had been shattered once again by the realities of their world. She waited, anxiously listening to the sounds of the unfolding events. She heard more gunshots, closer this time, followed by a scream, then silence. After what felt like an eternity, Salvatore returned, his face grim, his clothes stained with blood. He was not alone. He was supporting Marco, the soldato who had brought her the news of her father's death, who was now gravely wounded, his face pale, his breathing labored. "Marchetti's men," Salvatore said, his voice tight. They ambushed us. Marco, he saved my life." Juliana rushed to help, her concern for Marco overriding her fear. She helped Salvatore lower him to the floor, her hands trembling as she examined his wounds. "We need to get him to a doctor," she said, her voice urgent. "No," Salvatore said, his voice firm. "It's too dangerous. We can't trust anyone. We have to take care of him here." They worked together, tending to Marco's wounds, using the supplies Juliana had in the studio for cleaning her brushes and mixing her paints. She watched Salvatore, his hands surprisingly gentle as he cared for his loyal soldado, his face etched with worry and grief. She saw, once again, the man beneath the mask, the man who valued loyalty above all else, the man who was capable of great compassion and tenderness. As they worked, Marco, drifting in and out of consciousness, whispered something, his voice barely audible. "The letter, Signora Costa, I know everything." Juliana and Salvatore exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. Marco knew. He had known all along. He had been protecting Salvatore, shielding him from the truth. It was the price of his loyalty. And now he was paying the ultimate price. The air was heavy with the scent of blood and antiseptic, a grim reminder of the violence that continued to haunt them. Chapter 12. A dance of danger and desire. Marco's injuries were severe, but Juliana and Salvatore managed to stabilize him, working together with a quiet efficiency born of desperation. They moved him to a secure room within the palazzo, transforming it into a makeshift infirmary. Juliana used her knowledge of herbs and remedies, gleaned from her years in Tuscany, to create poultices and infusions to ease his pain and fight infection. Salvatore, despite his gruff exterior, proved to be a surprisingly attentive and capable caregiver, his concern for Marco genuine and heartfelt. The attack, and Marco's subsequent confession, brought a new level of urgency and danger to their lives. It was clear that the Marchettis were escalating their efforts, and that Salvatore's position was becoming increasingly precarious. He was forced to make difficult decisions, to take drastic measures to protect his family, his empire. He became even more guarded, more secretive, but he also began to rely on Juliana more, seeking her counsel, her support. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering belief in the possibility of a different future. He saw her as an ally, a partner, not just a wife. Their relationship shifted, evolving from a forced marriage into a complex dance of danger and desire, of fear and hope. They spent long hours together, tending to Marco, discussing the escalating conflict, sharing their fears and their dreams. They found solace in each other's company, a comfort in the shared burden they carried. They found moments of intimacy, of connection, amidst the chaos and violence that surrounded them. A stolen kiss in the dim light of the infirmary, a gentle touch as they worked side by side, a shared glance that spoke volumes. Juliana continued to paint, using her art as a way to process her emotions, to express her hopes and fears. She painted portraits of Marco, capturing his loyalty, his sacrifice, his unwavering devotion to Salvatore. She painted scenes of the palazzo, of the city, of the world around them, capturing the beauty and the ugliness, the light and the darkness. One evening, as they sat by Marco's bedside, watching him sleep, Salvatore turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "You're amazing," he said, his voice soft. "You never cease to surprise me." She smiled, a weary smile, but a genuine one. "We all have hidden depths, Salvatore," she said. "We just need the right circumstances to reveal them." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I'm glad I found you, Juliana," he said, his voice sincere. "You've changed me. You've made me see things differently." She squeezed his hand, her heart filled with a warmth that defied the cold reality of their world. "We've changed each other, Salvatore," she said. "We've saved each other." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss, filled with a depth of emotion that he had never shown her before. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect, of love. But their moment of peace was shattered by the arrival of one of Salvatore's men, his face grim, his voice urgent. "Don Salvatore," he said, his voice breathless. "We have a problem. The Marchettis, they've made their move." Salvatore's expression hardened, the mask of control slipping back into place. He released Juliana's hand, his focus shifting immediately to the business at hand. "What happened?" he demanded. "They've attacked one of our warehouses," the man said. "A major hit. We've lost everything." Salvatore cursed, his anger palpable. Assemble the men, he commanded. We're going to war. He turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination.
Stay here, he said.
Stay safe. I'll be back. He left the room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, the sounds of war preparations filling the palazzo. Juliana remained where she was, her heart pounding in her chest. The dance of danger and desire had reached a new, critical stage. She knew that their lives, their future, hung in the balance. The air was thick with the scent of impending violence, a storm brewing on the horizon. She could only wait and hope and pray that Salvatore would return to her. The silence in the room was broken only by Marco's shallow breathing, a fragile thread connecting them to the precariousness of life. Chapter 13. Shattered Reflections. The night that followed was a blur of chaos and violence. Juliana remained in the palazzo, confined to her rooms, her movements restricted, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. She could hear the distant sounds of gunfire, of explosions, of sirens, the echoes of the war that was raging in the streets of Rome. She paced restlessly, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She tried to distract herself, to focus on her sketching, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread, of impending doom. She prayed for Salvatore's safety, for Marco's recovery, for an end to the bloodshed. She prayed for a miracle, a way out of the endless cycle of violence and revenge. As the hours passed, the sounds of the fighting grew closer, more intense. She could hear shouts, commands, the unmistakable sounds of a struggle within the palazzo itself. She knew that the Marchettis had broken through their defenses, that they were coming for Salvatore, for her. She was trapped, cornered, with no escape. She armed herself with a small, antique pistol she had found in a drawer in Salvatore's study, a relic from a bygone era. It was a desperate measure, a futile attempt to defend herself, but it was all she had. She waited, her senses on high alert, her body tense, ready to fight. She heard footsteps approaching, heavy, deliberate, the tread of men intent on violence. The door to her rooms burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in, their faces grim, their eyes filled with hatred. They were Marchetti's men. She recognized their tattoos, their insignia. "Where is he?" one of them demanded, his voice harsh, his eyes scanning the room. Juliana stood her ground, her hand trembling as she raised the pistol, pointing it at the intruders. "He's not here," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. The men laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "You think you can stop us, little bird?" One of them sneered. "You're just a prize, a trophy to be claimed." "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice firm, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "You should be," another man said, stepping forward, his eyes fixed on her with a menacing glare. "We're going to take you to Don Marchetti, and he'll decide what to do with you." Before she had time to react, another man appeared in the doorway, older and more imposing. "Leave her," he commanded, his voice an authoritative rasp. "She is not to be touched without my consent." He moved slowly, like an aging lion, wounded but still deadly. Juliana saw his eyes. They were a mirror image, but older, more lined, more tired, of the man she had begun to love. This was Don Marchetti. "Salvatore will pay for this," Juliana said, her voice laced with defiance. Don Marchetti moved closer to her. Too close. She could smell his aftershave, an acrid scent that she had smelled somewhere before. On a letter, perhaps? Or maybe a scarf. "Salvatore," he said, his voice a venomous whisper, "is nothing. He's weak." He let sentimentality and a pretty face cloud his judgment. "This empire should have been mine. I was promised." "Promised?" Juliana asked, her voice a trembling challenge. Marchetti smiled, a predatory, unsettling grimace. "Your dear, departed father-in-law. And Isabella. They made a pact. I was to marry Isabella. I was the chosen one. But Lorenzo was impulsive.
He stole her from me.
And I have waited decades for my revenge." The pieces clicked into place, with sickening clarity. The letters, Alessandro, Isabella's scarf, the acrid aftershave. It had all been a lie. Marchetti was Alessandro. He had manipulated everyone, played both sides, fueled the feud, all for his own twisted ambition. Just as she was about to speak, to reveal the truth, the sound of gunfire erupted from the hallway, followed by shouts, by the sounds of a fierce struggle.
Salvatore.
He had returned. The men in her room turned, their attention shifting to the sounds of the fighting. Juliana seized the opportunity, firing the pistol, the shot echoing through the room. The bullet struck one of the men, knocking him off balance. Chaos erupted, a whirlwind of violence and confusion. Juliana fought with a desperate ferocity, using the element of surprise to her advantage. But she was outnumbered, outmatched. The men overpowered her, disarming her, knocking her to the ground. She looked up, her vision blurred, her body aching. She saw Don Marchetti standing over her, his face contorted with rage, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. "You're going to pay for that, little bird," he said, his voice a venomous whisper. He raised his hand, ready to strike. But then, a figure appeared behind him, a blur of motion, a flash of steel.
Salvatore.
He moved with a deadly grace, a predator unleashed. He engaged the men, fighting with a ferocity that Juliana had never seen before. He was a whirlwind of violence, a force of nature, driven by rage and a desperate need to protect her. The fight was brutal, savage, a dance of death. Men fell, bodies crumpled, blood spilled. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and fear. Juliana watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her body frozen with terror and awe. She saw Salvatore, fighting like a man possessed, risking his life to save hers. He reached Marchetti, his eyes blazing with fury. They grappled, their bodies locked in a deadly embrace. The struggle was brief, intense, a clash of titans. Salvatore overpowered Marchetti, disarming him, knocking him to the ground. He stood over him, his gun pointed at his head, his finger on the trigger. "It ends here," Salvatore said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. Marchetti looked up at him, his eyes filled with hatred and defiance. "You can't kill me," he said, his voice trembling. "You're not a killer." Salvatore hesitated for a moment, his finger tightening on the trigger. He looked at Juliana, his eyes searching hers. He saw the fear, the pain, but he also saw the strength, the resilience, the unwavering belief in him. He lowered his gun, his expression hardening. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not a killer, but I am a protector, and I will protect what's mine." He turned to his men, who had subdued the remaining Marchetti soldiers. "Take him," he commanded. "Lock him up. He'll answer for his crimes." He turned back to Juliana, his eyes softening, his expression filled with relief and concern. He knelt beside her, his hands gently touching her face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice trembling. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes," she whispered.
I'm alive."
He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his body shaking with the aftermath of the violence. He buried his face in her hair, his breath warm on her skin. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. She clung to him, her body trembling, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. She had survived. They had survived. But the reflections of their past, of their family's legacies, had been shattered, irrevocably altered. The future remained uncertain, but for now, in this moment, they were together, and that was all that mattered. The silence in the room was broken only by their ragged breathing, a testament to the battle they had fought and the uncertain peace they had won. Chapter 14. The Serpent's Embrace. The aftermath of the attack was a period of intense reckoning and difficult choices. Marchetti was imprisoned within the palazzo, awaiting a trial that would be more a formality than a true legal proceeding. The remaining Marchetti soldiers were either dead or had fled, their power broken, their threat neutralized. Salvatore, however, was not celebrating. He was consumed by a mixture of rage, guilt, and a profound sense of weariness. He had killed men. He had ordered the imprisonment of his mother's former lover. He had protected his empire, but at what cost? He retreated into himself, becoming even more distant and unapproachable. He spent hours in his study, poring over documents, making plans, trying to rebuild what had been destroyed. Juliana tried to reach out to him, to offer comfort, support, but he rebuffed her efforts, his heart seemingly closed off to her once again. She understood his pain, his struggle, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. She found herself drawn to Marchetti, to the man who had orchestrated so much chaos and destruction, the man who had revealed the truth about her family's past, about Isabella's betrayal. She visited him in his makeshift prison, a small, secure room in the depths of the palazzo. He was guarded, but she was allowed to see him, a testament to Salvatore's conflicted feelings, his inability to completely condemn the man who had once been his mother's lover. Marchetti was a shadow of his former self, his power stripped away, his arrogance replaced by a weary resignation. He looked old, defeated, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and regret.
Why?
Juliana asked him, her voice calm, controlled. Why did you do it? Why did you manipulate everyone? Why did you fuel the feud? He looked at her, his expression cynical. Power, he said, his voice raspy. It's all about power, control, legacy. But at what cost?
She challenged.
Look at what you've done. Look at the lives you've destroyed. He shrugged, a dismissive gesture.
Collateral damage, he said.
Necessary sacrifices. The price of ambition. She saw the emptiness in his eyes, the hollowness of his soul. He was a broken man, a man who had pursued power at all costs and had ended up with nothing. There's another way, she said, her voice firm. There's always another way. A way of peace, of forgiveness, of love. He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound.
Love?
He repeated. Love is a weakness, a vulnerability. It's a weapon to be used, manipulated, exploited. She realized that he was beyond redemption, that he was incapable of understanding, of changing. He was a serpent, trapped in his own embrace, consumed by his own venom. She left him, her heart filled with sadness and pity. She had tried to reach him, to offer him a glimmer of hope, but he had rejected it. He was a lost cause, a casualty of the endless cycle of violence and revenge. She returned to Salvatore, finding him in his study, his face buried in his hands, his body shaking with exhaustion and despair. He's gone, she said, her voice soft. Marchetti.
He's lost.
Salvatore looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, his expression filled with pain. I know, he said, his voice weary. I couldn't do it. I couldn't kill him. I know, she said, understanding. He stood up, moving towards her, his steps unsteady. He reached out and took her hands, his fingers interlacing with hers. I'm tired, Juliana, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I'm tired of the fighting, tired of the killing, tired of this life. She squeezed his hands, her heart aching for him. I know, she said, her voice trembling. I know. I want out, he said, his voice a whisper. I want a different life. A life with you. A life of peace. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. It's possible, Salvatore, she said, her voice firm. We can do it. We can break free. We can start over. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his body shaking with emotion. He buried his face in her hair, his breath warm on her skin. I love you, Juliana, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I love you more than anything in this world. She clung to him, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. I love you too, Salvatore, she whispered. I love you too. In that moment, standing there in the dimly lit study, surrounded by the remnants of their shattered past, they made a pact, a vow. They would leave this life behind. They would find a way to escape the serpent's embrace, to break the cycle of violence, to forge a new destiny, a new future, together. The air was thick with unspoken promises, a fragile hope blooming in the heart of their dangerous world. It was a turning point, a decision made in the depths of despair, a leap of faith towards an uncertain future. Chapter 15. Whispers in the Dark. The decision to leave was the easy part. The execution, however, was fraught with challenges and dangers. Salvatore's empire was vast and complex, its tentacles reaching into every corner of Italian society. Extricating themselves from its grip would be a delicate and dangerous operation, requiring careful planning, meticulous execution, and a considerable amount of luck. They began by secretly consolidating their assets, converting their wealth into untraceable forms, preparing for a life of anonymity, of escape. They worked in the dead of night, whispering their plans in the dark, their every move shadowed by the fear of discovery, of betrayal. Juliana used her artistic skills to forge documents, to create new identities, to erase their past. She transformed herself from the Don's wife into a master forger, her hands, once stained with paint, now stained with ink and the weight of their shared secret. Salvatore, despite his desire to leave, was still bound by a sense of responsibility, of loyalty to the men who had served him, who had risked their lives for him. He couldn't simply abandon them, leave them to face the consequences of his actions. He began to subtly shift the power structure within his organization, promoting those who shared his vision of a less violent future, demoting those who clung to the old ways. He started delegating authority, empowering his lieutenants, preparing them for a future without him. It was a risky game, a delicate balancing act. He had to maintain the appearance of control, of power, while simultaneously dismantling the very foundations of his empire. One evening, as they were working in Salvatore's study, poring over documents, planning their escape, they heard a knock on the door. Salvatore tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. "Who is it?" he demanded. "It's me," a voice said, a voice they both recognized.
Marco.
Salvatore exchanged a look with Juliana, a silent understanding passing between them. He opened the door, revealing Marco, his face pale, his body still weak from his injuries, but his eyes filled with a determined resolve. "I need to talk to you," Marco said, his voice firm. "Both of you." Salvatore ushered him inside, closing the door behind him. "What is it, Marco?" he asked, his voice guarded. Marco looked at them, his gaze shifting from Salvatore to Juliana, his expression serious. "I know what you're planning," he said, his voice low. "I know you're leaving." Juliana and Salvatore exchanged a nervous glance. They had been so careful, so secretive. How had he found out?
How?
Salvatore asked, his voice tight. Marco smiled, a weary smile, but a genuine one. "I've been with you for a long time, Don Salvatore," he said. "I know you. I see things. I hear things." He paused, then added, "And I overheard things. When I was recovering." He was referring to the night of the attack, when he had whispered about the letters, about Isabella, about his knowledge of the past. He had heard more than they had realized.
"And?"
Salvatore prompted, his voice tense. "And I want to help," Marco said, his voice firm. "I want to go with you." Juliana and Salvatore were stunned. They had expected resistance, opposition, perhaps even betrayal. But not this. Not loyalty.
"Why?"
Juliana asked, her voice filled with surprise. Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and admiration. "Because I believe in you," he said. "Both of you. I believe in what you're trying to do. I believe in a different future." He turned to Salvatore, his gaze unwavering. "I've served you faithfully for years, Don Salvatore," he said. "I've risked my life for you. I've killed for you. But I'm tired. Tired of the violence. Tired of the bloodshed. I want a different life. A life of peace." Salvatore studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. He saw the sincerity in Marco's eyes, the genuine desire for change. He saw the loyalty, the devotion that had never wavered, even in the face of death. "You know it's dangerous, Marco," Salvatore said, his voice grave. "It's a risk."
"We could all die."
"I know," Marco said, his voice firm. "But it's a risk worth taking. For a chance at a better life." Salvatore nodded, his decision made. "All right, Marco," he said. "You're with us."
Marco smiled, a relieved smile, a grateful smile.
"Thank you, Don Salvatore," he said. "Thank you, Signora Costa." The addition of Marco to their escape plan was a significant boost, both practically and emotionally. He knew the inner workings of Salvatore's empire. He had contacts, resources, that would be invaluable in their efforts to disappear. But it also increased the risk, the danger. They were now a trio, their movements more conspicuous, their escape more complicated. As they continued to plan, to prepare, the whispers in the dark grew louder, the shadows deeper. They knew that their time was running out, that they had to act soon, before their enemies discovered their plans, before their world came crashing down around them. The air was thick with anticipation and fear, a fragile hope hanging precariously in the balance. Chapter 16. The Heart's Rebellion. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They would disappear during the annual Festa di San Gennaro, the patron saint of Naples, a chaotic, crowded celebration that would provide the perfect cover for their escape. They would use Marco's contacts within the Port Authority to secure passage on a cargo ship bound for South America, a continent far removed from the reach of the Italian mafia. The days leading up to the festa were a blur of frantic activity. They finalized their preparations, gathering their forged documents, their untraceable funds, their essential belongings. They said their silent goodbyes to the palazzo, to the life they were leaving behind, to the ghosts of their past. Juliana found herself increasingly torn between her desire for freedom and her growing attachment to the people she had come to know, to care for, within the Costa household. She had formed bonds with the servants, with the staff, with the men who had served Salvatore, who had risked their lives for him. She knew that she couldn't take them with her, that it was too dangerous, too complicated. But she couldn't simply abandon them, leave them to face the uncertain future without her. She started subtly preparing them for her departure, hinting at changes to come, encouraging them to seek new opportunities, to forge their own paths. She used her influence with Salvatore to secure their positions, to ensure their safety, to the best of her ability. It was a bittersweet process, a mixture of sadness and hope. She was saying goodbye to a world she had once despised, but had come to understand, to appreciate, in its own twisted way. Salvatore, too, was struggling with the emotional weight of their decision. He was leaving behind his family's legacy, his empire, his entire identity. He was stepping into the unknown, with no guarantee of success, of survival. He became increasingly withdrawn, his mood fluctuating between determination and despair. He clung to Juliana, drawing strength from her unwavering belief in their future, from her love, from her unwavering support. One evening, as they were preparing for bed, he turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "Are you sure about this, Juliana?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Are you sure you want to do this? With me?" She looked at him, her heart overflowing with love and compassion. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of worry etched on his brow. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Salvatore," she said, her voice firm. "I'm with you. Always. No matter what." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his body shaking with emotion. He buried his face in her hair, his breath warm on her skin. "I love you, Juliana," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't deserve you. But I can't live without you." "And I can't live without you, Salvatore," she whispered back. "We're in this together. We'll face it together." They held each other, finding solace in their shared embrace, their shared love, their shared dream of a different future. It was a moment of intimacy, of connection, that transcended the chaos and danger that surrounded them. But even in that moment of peace, of love, there was an underlying tension, a sense of impending doom. They knew that their escape was a gamble, a desperate attempt to break free from the chains of their past. They knew that their enemies were watching, waiting, ready to strike. They knew that their hearts, their love, their rebellion against the forces that had shaped their lives, could be their undoing. The air in the room was thick with unspoken fears and desires, a fragile hope hanging precariously in the balance. It was a moment of calm before the storm, a final embrace before they stepped into the unknown. Chapter 17. A flicker of hope in the abyss. The day of the Festa di San Gennaro dawned bright and chaotic, the streets of Naples teeming with people, the air filled with the sounds of music, laughter, and the fervent prayers of the faithful. The city was a riot of color, a vibrant tapestry of life and activity, the perfect backdrop for their escape. Juliana, Salvatore, and Marco moved through the crowds, disguised as ordinary citizens, their faces hidden, their movements purposeful. They carried their forged documents, their untraceable funds, their hopes and fears, close to their hearts. They reached the port, a sprawling, labyrinthine complex of docks, warehouses, and ships, the air thick with the scent of salt, fish, and diesel fuel. Marco used his contacts to guide them through the maze of security checkpoints, avoiding the watchful eyes of the authorities, the potential threats of their enemies. They reached their designated cargo ship, a hulking, rusty vessel bound for Buenos Aires. Its name, Esperanza Hope, a fitting symbol of their desperate gamble. They boarded the ship, slipping unnoticed into the shadows, blending in with the crew, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were assigned a small, cramped cabin, deep within the bowels of the ship, a far cry from the opulent luxury of the Costa Palazzo, but a welcome refuge from the dangers they had left behind. As the ship prepared to depart, they stood on the deck, hidden in the shadows, watching the receding skyline of Naples, the city that had been their prison, their battleground, their home. Juliana felt a mixture of relief and sadness, of hope and fear. She was leaving behind a life of privilege and power, but also a life of violence and betrayal. She was stepping into the unknown, with no guarantee of success, of survival. Salvatore stood beside her, his arm around her waist, his grip tight, reassuring. He, too, was struggling with a mixture of emotions, his face a mask of stoic determination, hiding the turmoil within. Marco stood a few feet away, his eyes scanning the docks, the crowds, his hand resting on the gun hidden beneath his jacket. He was their protector, their guardian, his loyalty unwavering. As the ship's horn blared, signaling their departure, Juliana felt a tear trickle down her cheek. She was saying goodbye to her past, to her family, to her identity. She was embracing a new life, a new future, filled with uncertainty, but also with possibility. The ship began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed, pulling away from the dock, heading out into the open sea. The skyline of Naples grew smaller, fading into the distance, the sounds of the city replaced by the rhythmic churn of the engines, the creak of the hull, the cries of the seagulls. Juliana leaned against Salvatore, her head resting on his shoulder, her body trembling slightly. He held her close, his warmth, his strength, a comforting presence in the vastness of the ocean. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "Not yet," Salvatore said, his voice low, his tone guarded. "But we're on our way." He knew that their escape was far from over, that their enemies would not give up easily, that they would be pursued, hunted. He knew that the journey ahead would be long and arduous, filled with challenges and dangers. But he also knew that they had each other, that they had Marco, that they had a shared dream, a shared hope for a different future. And that, he believed, was enough to sustain them, to give them the strength to face whatever lay ahead. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold, Juliana looked out at the vast expanse of the ocean, her heart filled with a flicker of hope in the abyss of uncertainty. She saw a future, not of darkness and despair, but of light and possibility. A future where they could be free, where they could be themselves, where they could love each other without fear, without reservation. It was a fragile hope, a distant dream, but it was a hope worth fighting for, a dream worth pursuing. And as the ship sailed further into the night, carrying them towards an unknown destiny, she knew that they would face it together, their hearts united, their spirits unbroken. The air was filled with the scent of salt and freedom, a promise of a new beginning on the distant horizon. Chapter 18. The Unmasking. The voyage across the Atlantic was a period of uneasy calm, a tense interlude between their escape from Naples and their arrival in Buenos Aires. The vastness of the ocean, the endless horizon, provided a sense of isolation, of detachment from their past, but it also amplified their vulnerability, their awareness of the dangers that still lurked. They spent their days in the cramped cabin, keeping a low profile, avoiding unnecessary contact with the crew. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing their fears, their hopes, their dreams for the future. Juliana used her time to sketch, capturing the faces of her companions, the moods of the sea, the fleeting moments of beauty and tranquility that punctuated their journey. She found solace in her art, a way to process her emotions, to express her hopes and fears. Salvatore, despite his attempts to remain stoic, was visibly struggling with the emotional weight of their situation. He was haunted by the ghosts of his past, by the violence he had witnessed, by the choices he had made. He was grappling with his new identity, with the prospect of leaving behind everything he had ever known. He found himself increasingly drawn to Juliana, seeking her comfort, her support, her unwavering belief in their future. He spent hours watching her sketch, marveling at her talent, her ability to capture the essence of a moment, of a feeling on paper. One evening, as they were sitting on their makeshift beds, sharing a meager meal, he turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "I don't know what I would do without you, Juliana," he said, his voice sincere.
You've saved me.
"You've shown me a different way." She smiled, a weary smile, but a genuine one. "We've saved each other, Salvatore," she said. "We've found strength in each other." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I love you," he said, his voice a whisper. "I love you more than I ever thought possible." She squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing with love and compassion.
I love you too, Salvatore, she said.
"And I believe in us. I believe in our future." Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by a sudden, jarring sound, a loud banging on the cabin door. Salvatore tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he had managed to smuggle aboard. "Who is it?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "It's the captain," a voice said, a voice they didn't recognize. "I need to speak with you. Urgently." Salvatore exchanged a look with Juliana, a silent understanding passing between them. Something was wrong. He cautiously opened the door, revealing a tall, imposing man in a captain's uniform, his face grim, his eyes filled with suspicion. "What is it, Captain?" Salvatore asked, his voice guarded. "I have received a message," the captain said, his voice low. "From Naples. From your family." Juliana and Salvatore's heart sank. They had been discovered. Their escape had been compromised. "What message?" Salvatore asked, his voice tight. The captain held out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "This," he said. "It was delivered by a fast boat. They intercepted us." Salvatore took the paper, his hands trembling slightly. He unfolded it, revealing a few lines of hastily scrawled text, written in Italian. "We know you're on board. We know who you are. Surrender yourselves, or face the consequences. There is no escape." The message was unsigned, but they knew who it was from. The remnants of Salvatore's former organization, the men he had left behind, the enemies he had made. Salvatore looked at Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of despair and determination. "It's over," he said, his voice a whisper. "They've found us." But Juliana shook her head, her eyes blazing with defiance. "No," she said, her voice firm. "It's not over. We won't surrender. We'll fight." She turned to the captain, her gaze unwavering. "Captain," she said, "you have a choice. You can help us, or you can betray us. But know this. If you betray us, you will face the consequences. Not just from them, but from us." The captain looked at her, his expression unreadable. He saw the strength in her eyes, the determination, the unwavering belief in her cause. He saw the love between her and Salvatore, the bond that had been forged in the crucible of their shared suffering. He hesitated for a moment, weighing his options, calculating the risks. Then he made his decision. I will help you, he said, his voice firm. I have no love for the mafia. And I believe in a different future. He had seen something in their eyes, a flicker of hope, a spark of defiance that had convinced him to take a stand, to risk his own life to help them. A plan was hatched, a desperate gamble to turn the tables on their pursuers. The captain would stage a mutiny, pretending to have been overpowered by Salvatore and Marco. He would send a message back to Naples claiming that he had captured the fugitives, that he was bringing them back. It was a ruse, a deception, designed to lure their enemies into a trap. The ship would change course, heading not for Naples, but for a small, secluded island off the coast of Africa, a place where they could disappear, where they could start over. As the plan unfolded, the masks they had worn for so long began to crumble. Salvatore, the ruthless Don, became a vulnerable man, fighting for his love, for his freedom. Juliana, the reluctant bride, became a fierce warrior, her strength and resilience shining through. The unmasking was not just external, it was internal. They were shedding their old identities, their old fears, their old limitations. They were becoming who they were truly meant to be. The air was thick with tension and anticipation, a desperate hope clinging to the edge of a dangerous gamble. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. The captain's plan worked, to a point. The message sent to Naples successfully lured a small contingent of Salvatore's former associates, led by his ambitious and ruthless second-in-command, Riccardo, to intercept the cargo ship. Riccardo, who had always resented Salvatore's leadership and coveted his position, saw this as an opportunity to seize power, to eliminate his rival once and for all. Under the cover of darkness, Riccardo and his men boarded the Esperanza, expecting to find Salvatore and Juliana subdued and at the captain's mercy. Instead, they found themselves ambushed, caught in a carefully orchestrated trap. Salvatore, Marco, and the captain, along with a handful of loyal crew members who had been secretly recruited, engaged Riccardo and his men in a fierce, close-quarters battle. The ship became a chaotic battleground, the sounds of gunfire, shouts, and the clash of steel echoing through the night. Juliana, though armed and prepared to fight, was kept hidden in a secure location, protected by the captain. Salvatore had insisted on shielding her from the direct violence, his protective instincts overriding his desire for her assistance. The fight was brutal and bloody. Marco, despite his recent injuries, fought with a fierce determination, his loyalty to Salvatore unwavering. The captain, a seasoned veteran of the seas, proved to be a formidable ally, his knowledge of the ship and his tactical skills proving invaluable. Salvatore fought with a cold, calculated fury, his movements precise and deadly. He was no longer the hesitant, conflicted man who had boarded the ship. He was the Don, the leader, the warrior, fighting for his life, for his love, for his freedom. He confronted Riccardo in the ship's engine room, a claustrophobic, dimly lit space filled with the deafening roar of the machinery. The two men, once allies, now mortal enemies, faced each other, their eyes locked in a deadly gaze. "You betrayed me, Riccardo," Salvatore said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. Riccardo sneered, his face contorted with hatred. "You were weak, Salvatore," he said. "You let a woman cloud your judgment. You lost your nerve. You deserved to be betrayed." "I chose a different path," Salvatore said, his voice firm. "A path of peace, of love, of freedom." "There is no freedom, Salvatore," Riccardo said. "Only power. And now, that power will be mine." They engaged in a brutal, hand-to-hand fight, a struggle for dominance, for survival. The engine room became a cage of steel and fire, the air thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and diesel fuel. Salvatore, despite his superior skills, found himself struggling against Riccardo's younger, stronger physique. Riccardo was driven by a ruthless ambition, a desperate need to prove himself, to claim what he believed was rightfully his. Just as Riccardo was about to gain the upper hand, Juliana appeared, defying Salvatore's orders, her pistol drawn, her eyes blazing with fury. She had slipped away from the captain's protection, unable to stand idly by while Salvatore's life was in danger. Get away from him, she shouted, her voice echoing through the engine room. Ricardo turned, surprised by her sudden appearance, his focus momentarily diverted. Salvatore seized the opportunity, using his remaining strength to overpower Ricardo, disarming him, knocking him to the ground. He stood over Ricardo, his gun pointed at his head, his finger on the trigger. He looked at Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. Go back, Juliana, he said, his voice strained. This is not your fight. It's our fight, Salvatore, she said, her voice firm. We're in this together. He hesitated for a moment, his finger tightening on the trigger. He looked at Ricardo, his former lieutenant, his betrayer, the man who had tried to kill him, to steal his life. He saw the hatred in Ricardo's eyes, the defiance, the unrepentant ambition. He saw the reflection of his own past, of the violence and betrayal that had defined his life. He lowered his gun, his expression hardening. No, he said, his voice firm. It ends here. I won't kill you, Ricardo. I won't become like you. He turned to Marco, who had subdued the remaining members of Ricardo's crew. Take him, he commanded. Lock him up. He'll face justice. But not here. Not like this. The reckoning had come, but it was not the reckoning that Ricardo had expected. It was a reckoning of a different kind, a reckoning of the heart, a reckoning of the soul. Salvatore had chosen a different path, a path of mercy, of forgiveness, of hope. He had broken the cycle of violence. He had refused to be consumed by hatred, by revenge. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Salvatore stood on the deck of the ship, Juliana by his side, Marco standing guard nearby. They had survived the night. They had defeated their enemies. They had earned their freedom. But the journey was far from over. They were still adrift at sea, their destination uncertain, their future unknown. But they were together, and that, they knew, was all that mattered. The air was filled with the scent of salt and victory, a fragile peace dawning after a night of storm and strife. Chapter 20. A Kingdom Forged in Fire. The small, secluded island off the coast of Africa was a world away from the opulent palazzos of Rome and the bustling streets of Naples. It was a place of rugged beauty, of untamed nature, of quiet solitude. A place where they could disappear, where they could start over, where they could build a new life, far from the reach of the mafia, far from the shadows of their past. They landed on the island under the cover of darkness, guided by the captain, who had become their unlikely ally, their friend. He provided them with supplies, with information, with contacts, helping them to establish a foothold in this new, unfamiliar world. They found a small, abandoned village on the far side of the island, a cluster of simple, whitewashed houses nestled amongst palm trees and overlooking a pristine, turquoise bay. It was a place of peace, of tranquility, a place where they could heal, where they could rebuild. They adopted new identities, becoming Juliana and Salvatore Rossi, a simple couple seeking a quiet life, far from the troubles of the world. Marco, too, adopted a new name, becoming their loyal companion, their protector, their friend. They spent their days rebuilding the village, repairing the houses, cultivating the land, learning to live off the sea and the earth. They worked side by side, their hands calloused, their bodies tanned by the sun, their spirits renewed by the simple rhythms of nature. Juliana rediscovered her passion for art, capturing the beauty of the island, the vibrant colors of the flora and fauna, the serenity of the ocean on canvas. She found solace in her creativity, a way to express her emotions, to celebrate her newfound freedom. Salvatore, too, found a new purpose, a new sense of fulfillment. He used his skills, his knowledge, his leadership abilities to help the local community, to improve their lives, to build a better future. He became a respected figure, a leader, not through fear and intimidation, but through compassion and service. They built a new life, a new kingdom, not of power and wealth, but of love and peace. A kingdom forged in fire, tested by adversity, strengthened by their shared commitment to a different future. They learned to live without the luxuries, the privileges of their former lives. They learned to appreciate the simple things, the beauty of a sunset, the taste of fresh fish, the sound of the waves crashing on the shore. They learned to trust each other, completely, unconditionally. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams, their vulnerabilities. They became not just husband and wife, but partners, soulmates, friends. One evening, as they were sitting on the beach, watching the sun set over the ocean, Juliana turned to Salvatore, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "We did it," she said, her voice soft. "We really did it." Salvatore smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that reflected the peace and happiness he had found. "Yes," he said, "we did. We built our own kingdom." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "And it's a better kingdom, Juliana," he said. "A kingdom of love, of peace, of freedom." She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her body close to his. She felt the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his heart, the strength of his spirit. "I love you, Salvatore," she whispered. "I love you more than words can say." "And I love you, Juliana," he whispered back. "You are my queen, my heart, my everything." They sat there in silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. They were surrounded by beauty, by peace, by the vastness of the ocean, by the promise of a new day. They had faced their demons, they had overcome their challenges, they had broken free from their past. They had forged a new destiny, a new future, a new life, together. Their kingdom was not a kingdom of power and wealth, but a kingdom of the heart, a kingdom of the soul. It was a kingdom built on love, on trust, on forgiveness, on hope. It was a kingdom that would endure, that would thrive, that would stand as a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity, to find peace, to create beauty, to build a better world. The air was filled with the scent of salt and serenity, a quiet triumph echoing in the gentle lapping of the waves. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, a life lived on their own terms. Epilogue. Years passed. The scars of the past faded, but they never completely disappeared. They served as a reminder of the life they had left behind, of the struggles they had overcome, of the love that had sustained them. Juliana and Salvatore Rossi, as they were now known, became integral members of the island community. They built a school, a clinic, a small trading post, helping to improve the lives of the local people, sharing their knowledge, their skills, their resources. Juliana's art flourished, her paintings capturing the vibrant beauty of the island, the spirit of its people, the serenity of their new life. Her work became known, sought after, bringing a touch of their hidden paradise to the outside world. Salvatore, using his innate leadership abilities, became a respected elder, a wise counselor, a mediator, resolving disputes, guiding the community, ensuring its prosperity and peace. He had found his true calling, not as a don, but as a servant leader, a man of the people. Marco remained their loyal companion, their protector, their friend. He found love with a local woman, settling down, starting a family, finding the peace and happiness he had long sought. They never forgot their past, but they no longer let it define them. They had learned from their mistakes, they had forgiven their enemies, they had embraced their new life, their new identities. One day, a small yacht appeared on the horizon, approaching the island. It was an unexpected visitor, a reminder of the world they had left behind. Juliana and Salvatore watched from the beach, their hearts filled with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Who was it? Had they been found? Was their peaceful existence about to be shattered? The yacht anchored in the bay, and a small dinghy was lowered, carrying a single figure towards the shore. As the figure drew closer, Juliana and Salvatore recognized him. It was Leo, Salvatore's former lawyer, the man who had handled his affairs, who had helped them to consolidate their assets, to prepare for their escape. He was older now, his hair grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes still held the same intelligence, the same loyalty. He stepped onto the beach, his gaze sweeping over Juliana and Salvatore, a smile spreading across his face. "I found you," he said, his voice filled with relief and admiration. I finally found you. They greeted him warmly, inviting him into their home, sharing a meal, exchanging stories. Why did you come, Leo? Salvatore asked, his voice cautious. To bring you news, Leo said. And to offer my services, if you need them. He explained that the world they had left behind had changed. The old mafia families had crumbled, their power diminished, their influence waning. A new generation had risen, one that was less interested in violence and more interested in legitimate business, in cooperation, in peace. There is no threat, Leo said. You are safe. You can come home, if you wish. Juliana and Salvatore exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. They had built a new life, a new home on this island. They had found peace, happiness, fulfillment. They had no desire to return to the shadows of their past. Thank you, Leo, Salvatore said, his voice firm. But we are home. This is our home now. Leo nodded, understanding. I understand, he said. And I respect your decision. You have built something remarkable here. Something beautiful. He stayed with them for a few days, sharing stories, offering advice, renewing their friendship. Then, he departed, sailing away on his yacht, leaving them to their peaceful existence. As Juliana and Salvatore watched the yacht disappear over the horizon, they knew that they had made the right choice. They had chosen love over power, peace over violence, freedom over obligation. They had built a kingdom, not of gold and jewels, but of love and laughter, of family and friendship, of peace and serenity. It was a kingdom that would endure, a legacy that would live on, long after they were gone. They turned and walked back towards their home, hand in hand, their hearts filled with gratitude, with love, with the quiet joy of a life well lived. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the island, a benediction on their peaceful kingdom, a testament to the enduring power of hope, of forgiveness, of love. The gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers and the sea, a whispered promise of a future filled with peace and happiness. The end.